I've been thinking a lot about reality lately, and not in some abstract philosophical way, but in a very concrete, almost unsettling way, because there's this idea, this possibility that keeps coming up in both scientific circles and late night conversations. And once you really start thinking about it, it's hard to shake. What if everything we experience, everything we think we know about the world, what if it's not actually real in the way we assume? What if we're living inside a simulation, like characters in an incredibly sophisticated computer program, and we just don't know it? And I know how that sounds. It sounds like science fiction, like something out of the Matrix, like the kind of thing you'd dismiss as philosophical navel-gazing. But here's the thing that gets me, the thing that makes this more than just idle speculation. Some of the smartest physicists and philosophers alive today take this idea seriously, very seriously. And when you look at the arguments, when you really examine the logic and the science behind it, you start to realize that this isn't crazy at all. In fact, it might actually be the most reasonable explanation for what we are and where we are. So let me take you through this, because it's worth understanding, worth really sitting with. And I promise by the end of this, you'll see reality differently. You might not be convinced we're in a simulation, but you'll understand why we might be, and why that possibility is so much more plausible than you ever imagined. The journey here takes us through computer science and quantum mechanics, through consciousness and cosmology, through ancient philosophy and cutting-edge physics. And what's remarkable is how all these different fields, when you look at them closely, seem to be pointing in the same strange direction. Let's start with something simple, something we all understand: video games. I mean, think about how far video games have come in just the last few decades. I remember playing games in the early 90s, these blocky, pixelated worlds that barely resembled reality, and we thought they were amazing at the time, right? We'd spend hours navigating these crude digital landscapes, completely immersed in worlds that, looking back, were laughably primitive. But even then, even in those early days, there was something captivating about it, something that hinted at what might be possible. Fast forward to today, and we have games that are almost photorealistic. We have virtual reality headsets that can trick your brain into believing you're somewhere else entirely. We have AI characters that can respond to you in ways that feel genuinely intelligent, genuinely alive. And this happened in what, 30, 40 years? That's nothing. That's a blink of an eye in historical terms. Now here's where it gets interesting. There's this concept in computer science called Moore's Law, named after Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel. Back in 1965, Moore observed that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles about every 2 years, which means computing power doubles roughly every 2 years. And for decades, this held true. It's only recently that we've started to see it slow down a bit, but even accounting for that, the trajectory is staggering. If you plot the growth of computing power over time, it's not a straight line, it's exponential. It curves upward sharply, dramatically. And exponential growth, it's hard for our brains to grasp intuitively because we're not wired to think that way. We think linearly. But exponential growth means that changes don't just add up, they multiply. Each step forward makes the next step bigger. It's like compounding interest, but for technology. So if we can create fairly convincing simulations now, and if computing power continues to grow exponentially, what will be possible in 100 years, in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years? And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that somewhere out there in the universe, there's a civilization that's been around for millions of years, a civilization that's had time to develop technology that's as far beyond ours as ours is beyond that of someone living in ancient Rome. What could they create? What kind of simulations could they run? And here's the kicker. Here's the thing that makes you pause. If they could create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality, simulations where the beings inside the simulation are conscious and aware and don't realize they're in a simulation, how would we know if we're not in one of those simulations right now? This is the core of what's called the simulation hypothesis, or the simulation argument, and it was most famously articulated by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom in a paper he published in 2003. Bostrom's argument is elegant and honestly kind of terrifying in its logic. He doesn't claim that we definitely are in a simulation. Instead, he argues that at least one of 3 propositions must be true. Either civilizations like ours tend to go extinct before they reach the technological capability to run these kinds of simulations, or they reach that capability but choose not to run them for some reason, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. Those are the three options. And when you think about it, when you really work through the logic, it's hard to escape the force of the argument. Let's break it down. First option, civilizations go extinct before reaching simulation capability. This could happen lots of ways. Maybe we destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons. Maybe climate change makes the planet uninhabitable. Maybe there's some great filter, some catastrophic event or challenge that all civilizations face, and most don't survive it. This is actually one of the proposed solutions to the Fermi paradox. The question of why we haven't seen any evidence of alien civilizations if the universe is so big and so old. Maybe they're all dying out before they get advanced enough. It's a grim thought, but it's possible. Second option, civilizations reach the capability to run simulations but choose not to. Maybe there are ethical considerations. Maybe advanced civilizations decide it would be wrong to create conscious beings and trap them in a simulated reality without their knowledge. Or maybe they just lose interest. Maybe once you reach a certain level of technological advancement, running simulations of primitive civilizations just doesn't appeal to you anymore. Like, we could theoretically create incredibly detailed simulations of ant colonies, watching them go about their little ant lives, but most people don't bother because, well, it's not that interesting to us. Maybe we're the ants and some future civilization could simulate us but decides not to because it's not worth their time. But here's where Bostrom's argument gets really interesting. If neither of those first two options is true, if civilizations don't go extinct and they do choose to run simulations, then the third option becomes almost inevitable. Because think about it. If a sufficiently advanced civilization wanted to run simulations of their ancestors, of primitive versions of themselves, they could run an enormous number of such simulations. We're not talking about 1 or 2 or even 1,000. We're talking about billions, trillions, potentially an almost unlimited number. Each simulation could contain billions of conscious beings, all living their lives completely unaware they're in a simulation. And if that's the case, if there are trillions upon trillions of simulated realities and only one base reality, then statistically, probabilistically, we're almost certainly in one of the simulated ones. It's just a numbers game. The simulated universes would vastly outnumber the real one. And you can't easily dismiss this by saying, well, but we're special, we're in the real one. That's like flipping a coin 1 trillion times, getting heads every single time and saying, well, sure, tails was vastly more likely, but I got heads, so that's just how it worked out. Statistically, it doesn't make sense. If simulated realities outnumber base reality by a massive margin, and we have no way to know which type we're in, then the odds favor us being in a simulation. It's uncomfortable, maybe even disturbing, but it's logically sound. Now you might be thinking, okay, but this is all very abstract. It's a thought experiment. Is there any actual evidence, any reason beyond pure logic to think we might be in a simulation? And that's where things get really fascinating, because when you start looking at certain aspects of physics and reality itself, you start noticing things that are, well, weird, things that make more sense if reality is computational than if it's fundamental. Take quantum mechanics, for instance. Quantum mechanics is the branch of physics that deals with the very small, with atoms and subatomic particles. And it's profoundly strange. It's so strange that even physicists who work with it every day admit they don't really understand what it means. They just know that it works. One of the central features of quantum mechanics is something called the observer effect, or wave function collapse. Basically, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. Before measurement, they exist in what's called a superposition, a state where they're kind of everything at once, all possible states simultaneously. It's only when you observe them, when you measure them, that they collapse into a definite state. This is famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat, that thought experiment where a cat is in a box with a device that might or might not kill it based on a quantum event. Until you open the box and look, the cat is theoretically both alive and dead at the same time. It's in a superposition of states. Now, Schrödinger proposed this to show how absurd quantum mechanics seemed when applied to everyday objects. But the underlying principle holds for particles. They really do seem to exist in these fuzzy, indefinite states until observed. And here's why that's relevant to the simulation hypothesis. This is exactly how a simulation would work. If you're running a simulation, you don't want to waste computational resources calculating things that no one's observing. That would be incredibly inefficient. Instead, you'd only fully render things when someone's looking at them. The rest of the time, they'd exist in a kind of compressed state, a state of potential rather than actuality. And that's essentially what quantum superposition looks like. It's as if reality is optimizing for computational efficiency, only rendering things fully when necessary. There's another aspect of quantum mechanics that's relevant here, something called quantum entanglement. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance, and it refers to the way particles can be connected such that measuring one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. You can have two entangled particles on opposite sides of the universe, and if you measure one, the other immediately knows and responds accordingly. This happens faster than light could travel between them, which seems to violate everything we know about the speed limit of the universe. Einstein hated this, thought there must be some hidden variable we weren't seeing. But experiments have confirmed it over and over. Quantum entanglement is real. Now, in a simulation, this makes perfect sense. If reality is computational, if particles are essentially objects in a vast program, then they don't need to send signals to each other through space. They're both just entries in the same database, so to speak. Change one, and the program updates the other instantly. There's no distance to traverse because they're not really separate in the way we think of physical separation. Yeah, they're just data points in a computational system. The spookiness disappears if you think of reality as information rather than as physical substance. And then there's the way physics seems to have fundamental limits, fundamental constants that feel arbitrary but are precisely calibrated. The speed of light, for instance. Why is the speed of light exactly 299,792,458 meters per second? Why not faster or slower? In a physical universe, there's no obvious reason it should be any particular speed. But in a simulation, you'd need a maximum speed for information propagation, a kind of processing speed limit. And that's what the speed of light looks like, a maximum rate at which information can move through the system. It's not about light per se, it's about causality, about how fast changes in one part of the universe can affect another part. And that maximum speed, that hard limit, it feels less like a property of physical light and more like a property of a computational substrate. The same goes for things like the Planck length and Planck time, these incredibly tiny scales below which our physics equations break down. The Planck length is about 10 to the negative 35 meters, unimaginably small, and it's thought to be the smallest meaningful length in the universe. Below that scale, the concept of distance itself might not make sense. Similarly, Planck time is about 10 to the negative 44 seconds, and it might be the smallest meaningful unit of time. Now, why would the universe have these fundamental limits on space and time? In a continuous, purely physical reality, there's no obvious reason. But in a simulation, in a computational universe, these would be the equivalent of pixels and frames. They'd be the resolution of the simulation, the smallest units the program can handle. Below that, there's no finer detail because the simulation doesn't have infinite resolution. It's pixelated at the Planck scale. And here's something that really makes physicists scratch their heads. The universe seems to be governed by mathematical laws that are both extraordinarily precise and extraordinarily elegant. Why should the universe follow mathematical laws at all? Why should we be able to describe the behavior of galaxies and atoms with equations? As the physicist Eugene Wigner famously put it, there's an unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in describing the natural world. It's as if the universe is written in mathematics. But if reality is actually a simulation, then of course it would be mathematical at its core. Programs are mathematical. Code is mathematical. If we're in a simulation, then discovering that the universe follows mathematical laws isn't mysterious at all. It's exactly what we'd expect. The universe looks mathematical because it is mathematical, because it's computational. Now let's talk about something even stranger, something that touches on the nature of consciousness itself. Because one of the big questions in the simulation hypothesis is, could simulated beings be conscious? Could artificial entities inside a computer program actually experience awareness, have subjective experiences, feel things? Or would they just be philosophical zombies, things that behave as if they're conscious but have no inner life? This is crucial because if we're going to take seriously the idea that we might be in a simulation, we have to grapple with whether simulated consciousness is even possible. And the answer, according to many philosophers and cognitive scientists, is yes. There's a concept called substrate independence, which basically means that consciousness doesn't depend on being implemented in biological neurons specifically. As long as the right kind of information processing is happening, as long as the right computational patterns are present, consciousness could theoretically emerge. It doesn't matter if it's happening in a brain made of meat or in a computer made of silicon or in some alien technology we can't even imagine. What matters is the pattern, the process, not the physical substrate. Think about it this way. Your consciousness right now is arising from electrochemical signals in your brain, neurons firing in particular patterns. But what if we could map all those neurons, all those connections, and recreate the exact same pattern in a computer? Would that digital version of you be conscious? Most neuroscientists and philosophers think the answer is yes, that if you perfectly replicate the information processing that gives rise to consciousness in a human brain, you get consciousness in the simulation too. And if that's true, then simulated beings could be just as conscious, just as real in their subjective experience as biological beings. We could be simulated and still be genuinely conscious, genuinely experiencing reality, even if that reality is itself not fundamental. This leads to some really profound questions about personal identity and the nature of self. If consciousness is substrate independent, if what matters is the pattern rather than the material, then in some sense, you're not your body. You're not even your specific brain. You're the pattern of information processing that's currently happening, and that pattern could theoretically be copied, moved, instantiated in different substrates. This has wild implications. It means that if you could upload your mind to a computer, that upload would be you, or at least a version of you with as much claim to being you as you have right now. It means that the boundary between real and simulated becomes blurry, maybe even meaningless. And here's where it gets even weirder. If we're in a simulation, whose simulation is it? Who's running it? And are they in a simulation too? This is the nested simulation problem, or simulation within simulation scenario. If advanced civilizations can run simulations, and those simulations can contain beings who eventually become advanced enough to run their own simulations, you could have simulations, within simulations, layers upon layers of nested realities. And if that's possible, then not only might we be in a simulation, but there might be many, many layers above us. We could be simulated beings living in a universe created by other simulated beings, who themselves are in a simulation created by other simulated beings, and so on. At some point, there must be a base reality, an original universe that's not simulated, but we could be arbitrarily far down the stack. This is sometimes called the turtles all the way down problem, after an old philosophical joke about a cosmology where the Earth rests on the back of a giant turtle, which stands on another turtle, which stands on another turtle. And when asked what the bottom turtle stands on, the answer is, it's turtles all the way down. In the simulation hypothesis, it's simulations all the way down until you hit that base reality that we might never be able to access or even detect. Now let's think about the implications of all this for free will and determinism. If we're in a simulation, does that mean everything is predetermined? Is our entire existence just a program running through its predetermined steps? Or could we have genuine free will even within a simulation? This is tricky because it depends on how the simulation works. If it's deterministic, if every state follows necessarily from the previous state according to fixed rules, then yes, everything would be predetermined. The future would already be determined by the initial conditions and the laws of the simulation, but that's also true of a purely physical universe governed by the laws of physics. Determinism doesn't require a simulation. It's a feature of any universe with causal laws. On the other hand, the simulation could include randomness, could include genuinely probabilistic elements. Quantum mechanics suggests that our universe has fundamental randomness at its core. If the simulation includes quantum randomness, then it's not fully deterministic, and there's room for unpredictability, maybe even for free will of a sort. But does randomness equal free will? That's debatable. If your choices are determined by random quantum events in your brain, are they really your choices? Or are you just a passenger watching random processes unfold? The truth is, The free will question is just as puzzling in a base reality as in a simulation. Whether we're in the fundamental universe or a simulated one doesn't really change the essential problem. Either our choices are determined by prior causes, or they involve randomness, or there's some third option we don't understand. The simulation hypothesis doesn't make the problem worse. It just gives us a different context in which to think about it. But there are other implications that are more specific to the simulation hypothesis. For instance, if we're in a simulation, could we detect it? Could we find evidence that would prove we're in a simulation rather than a base reality? Some physicists have proposed ways we might look for glitches or artifacts of a simulation. For example, if the universe is fundamentally computational, it might have a limited precision, like how computer simulations have rounding errors. We might be able to detect these by looking for subtle irregularities in physical constants, or by studying cosmic rays and seeing if there are patterns that suggest a computational origin. There's also the idea of looking for the edges of the simulation, for places where the simulation's resources are being stretched thin. Think about how video games work. They render the environment around you in high detail, but distant objects are less detailed, and things outside your field of view might not be rendered at all. Could the universe work the same way? Could there be evidence that reality is more filled in where we're looking and less so elsewhere? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, seem to suggest that the universe does indeed behave differently depending on what we choose to measure, almost as if it's adapting to our observations. Then there are these strange phenomena that people sometimes point to as possible evidence of simulation glitches. Things like the Mandela effect, where large groups of people remember events or details differently from how they're recorded. Now, most of these can probably be explained by ordinary false memory and cognitive biases. Our memories are notoriously unreliable, but some people wonder if these shared false memories could be artifacts of the simulation being updated or edited, with some people retaining memories from a previous version. It's a fun idea, though there's no real evidence for it. Déjà vu is another phenomenon that people sometimes link to the simulation hypothesis, that eerie feeling that you've experienced something before, even though you know you haven't. In The Matrix, this is explained as a glitch, a moment when the program changes something and you notice the discontinuity. In reality, neuroscientists have much more mundane explanations involving memory formation and retrieval processes in the brain. But it's interesting how these experiences feel so much like what we'd expect from a simulation glitch. And then there's synchronicity, those moments when coincidences seem too meaningful to be random. You think of someone you haven't heard from in years and they call you that day. You need a specific piece of information and a book falls off a shelf open to exactly the right page. These experiences are powerful and they feel significant. From a simulation perspective, you could imagine these as intentional prompts, as ways for those running the simulation to guide events or test responses. But again, probability and psychology provide adequate explanations. With billions of people having thousands of thoughts and experiences every day, some wild coincidences are bound to happen just by chance. Our brains are also wired to find patterns and meaning even where none exists. So while synchronicities feel profound, they're not really evidence of anything beyond the way human minds work. Still, the fact that reality sometimes feels strange, that there are these moments where things seem off or too coincidental or weirdly meaningful, it does make you wonder, if we are in a simulation, would we notice? Would there be signs, or would the simulation be so good, so seamless, that we'd have no way of detecting it from the inside? And that's a genuinely difficult question, because if the simulators are sufficiently advanced, if they want to keep us from knowing we're in a simulation, they could presumably patch any glitches, smooth over any inconsistencies. We might be living in a reality that's been carefully designed to seem completely real and consistent, with no detectable seams. Now let's think about the purpose of such a simulation, if it exists. Why would anyone run a simulation of a universe like ours? What would be the point? There are several possibilities. One is scientific curiosity. Maybe advanced civilizations run simulations to study how universes evolve, how life emerges, how civilizations develop. They could be running thousands or millions of variations, tweaking initial conditions or physical laws to see what happens. We'd be like the subjects in a vast cosmic experiment, our entire history and future unfolding for the observation and analysis of beings outside our reality. Another possibility is entertainment. Maybe we're a form of art or storytelling for beings in the base reality. They might be watching our lives unfold like we watch movies or read novels, experiencing the drama and tragedy and comedy of human existence vicariously. This is a bit disturbing to think about, the idea that our suffering and joy might be entertainment for others, but it's not impossible. We do this ourselves with fiction, creating characters and putting them through trials for our own engagement. If those characters were conscious, if they experienced their fictional hardships as real, would that make it unethical? That's a troubling question without an easy answer. A third possibility is educational. Maybe the simulation is a kind of school or training ground. Young members of the advanced civilization might live through a simulated life to learn and grow, to experience challenges and develop in ways that aren't possible in their comfortable base reality. Your entire life, your entire identity might be a temporary role being played by a student in a civilization so advanced that they can create and inhabit fully immersive, simulated realities as easily as we attend classes. Or maybe the simulation has a more practical purpose. Maybe it's being used to solve computational problems, to run through scenarios and possibilities. Or maybe the simulation is a form of preservation or reconstruction. Perhaps our entire universe is an historical recreation, a detailed simulation of what happened in the base reality billions of years ago. We could be living through a recreation of someone else's actual history. Every event, a perfect replay of something that already occurred in another reality. And here's a particularly mind-bending possibility. Maybe there is no separate base reality. Maybe the simulation creates itself, a kind of strange loop where the universe simulates itself into existence. This gets into some very deep philosophical territory, into questions about the nature of existence and causality that don't have clear answers. But if reality is fundamentally informational, if existence itself is computational, then maybe there doesn't need to be a material substrate at all. The simulation could be self-instantiating, existing not as a program running on some external hardware, but as a self-contained logical structure that simply is. This connects to some old philosophical ideas about the nature of reality. Plato, way back in ancient Greece, proposed that the physical world we experience is just a shadow of a higher reality, a realm of perfect forms. What we see and touch is like shadows on a cave wall, imperfect reflections of something more real and more true. The simulation hypothesis is weirdly similar. If we're in a simulation, the physical reality we experience isn't the fundamental reality. It's a representation, an interface, shadows cast by something more basic. What we think of as matter and energy and space and time might just be the way the fundamental information layer appears to us, the way the underlying code renders on our consciousness. And this leads to some really interesting thoughts about the nature of physical law itself. We think of the laws of physics as fundamental, as describing how reality actually works. But if we're in a simulation, those laws are more like the rules of a game, constraints programmed in by the creators of the simulation. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all of it could be arbitrary choices made by whoever designed the simulation. In another simulation, with different rules, physics might work completely differently. Gravity might repel instead of attract, light might move at a different speed, particles might have different properties. This raises a profound question. Are the laws of physics even laws in any meaningful sense, or are they just the particular rules of this particular simulation? In our universe, objects fall down. Entropy increases. Light travels at a constant speed. But these might not be universal truths. They might just be local facts about this specific instantiation of reality, and that's both exciting and unsettling. Exciting because it suggests a vastness of possibility beyond what we can observe. Unsettling because it means that what we think of as fundamental might not be fundamental at all. Let's talk about consciousness again, but from a different angle. If we're in a simulation and we're conscious, does that mean the simulation itself is conscious? Is the entire universe, if it's computational, a giant thinking thing? This is an idea with roots In panpsychism, the philosophical view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present at all levels of organization. If reality is computational information processing and consciousness arises from information processing, then maybe the universe as a whole has some form of awareness. Not necessarily human-like consciousness, not necessarily anything we'd recognize, but some form of inner experience, some subjective dimension to its existence. Or maybe consciousness is more localized, specific to certain complex patterns of information processing. Your brain is conscious because it has the right kind of organized complexity. A rock isn't conscious because it doesn't have that kind of organization. In a simulation, the question would be, what patterns give rise to consciousness and where are those patterns present? Are only the simulated beings conscious, or is the computational substrate itself conscious in some way? These are questions that get at the very heart of what consciousness is and how it relates to physical or computational reality. There's also the question of other minds, which is a classic problem in philosophy. How do you know that other people are conscious? You know you're conscious because you directly experience your own awareness, but you can't directly experience anyone else's consciousness. You see people behaving in ways consistent with being conscious, you talk to them and they respond intelligently, but you can't know for certain that there's anyone home, so to speak. They could be philosophical zombies, entities that act exactly like conscious beings but have no inner experience. In practice, we assume other people are conscious because they're similar to us, and it would be weird if we were the only conscious being. But we can't prove it. In a simulation, this problem takes on a new dimension. Maybe only some of the entities in the simulation are conscious. Maybe you're the only conscious being, and everyone else is an NPC, a non-player character, programmed to interact with you but not actually aware. This is called solipsism, the idea that only your own mind is certain to exist. It's philosophically irrefutable, but also kind of absurd to actually believe. Still, in a simulation designed to be experienced by one consciousness, everyone else could be just sophisticated bots. You'd never know the difference from the inside. Or maybe consciousness is distributed in weird ways in the simulation. Maybe some beings are fully conscious, others partially so, others not at all. Maybe consciousness comes in degrees, with simple creatures having simple forms of awareness and complex creatures like humans having rich, elaborate inner lives. Or maybe it's not about complexity at all. Maybe consciousness is assigned arbitrarily by whoever's running the simulation. Some entities get to be conscious because that's part of the design, others don't. There's no way to know from the inside which category you fall into, though the fact that you're experiencing this would suggest you're in the conscious category. Now, if we are in a simulation, what does that mean for ethics and morality? Does it change how we should behave, what we should value? Some people think it would make everything meaningless. If we're just characters in someone else's game, why does anything matter? But I don't think that follows. Even if we're in a simulation, we're still conscious. We still experience joy and suffering. We still have relationships and aspirations and fears. The subjective reality of our experience doesn't go away just because the objective reality is computational rather than material. In fact, you could argue that being in a simulation doesn't change ethics at all. What matters morally is consciousness and experience. Suffering is bad and happiness is good, regardless of whether it's happening in a base reality or a simulation. If you're in pain, that pain is real to you. If you love someone, that love is genuine. The substrate doesn't matter, the experience does. So even if we discovered tomorrow that we're definitely in a simulation, that wouldn't give us license to act differently. We'd still have the same responsibilities to each other and to ourselves. There might even be additional ethical considerations. If we're in a simulation, there might be beings outside the simulation who can observe us or interact with us. That could introduce a kind of cosmic accountability, a sense that our actions matter not just within this reality, but to observers beyond it. Of course, we don't know if such observers exist or what their values are. They might not care about our ethics at all, but the possibility is there. And what if we develop the capability to create our own simulations with conscious beings? That's a real possibility in the not too distant future. If we can create conscious AIs and run them in simulated environments, we'll become the simulators ourselves. And that comes with serious ethical responsibilities. What duties do we have to the conscious beings we create? Do we have the right to create them at all? If we create a simulated being who suffers, are we responsible for that suffering? These are not hypothetical questions. They're things we'll need to grapple with as our technology advances. Let's shift gears and think about time in the simulation hypothesis. In a simulation, time might not work the way we think it does. From inside the simulation, time seems to flow smoothly from past to future, each moment giving way to the next. But from outside the simulation, from the perspective of whoever's running it, time might be much more flexible. The entire history of the simulated universe, from Big Bang to heat death, might exist all at once as a data structure. The simulators could scroll through it, jump to different moments, run it backward or forward. To them, our entire timeline might be static, a completed program they can navigate like a movie. This has interesting implications for questions about the beginning and end of the universe. From our perspective, time seems to have a beginning, the Big Bang, and it might have an end, the heat death of the universe when entropy is maximized and nothing can happen anymore. But if we're in a simulation, those might just be the boundary conditions of the program, the temporal limits of what's being simulated. Before the Big Bang and after the heat death, there might be nothing, not because time itself begins and ends, but because that's the scope of this particular simulation. Outside the simulation, in the base reality, time might work completely differently or might not exist at all. There's also the question of whether time passes at the same rate in the simulation and outside it. From our perspective, billions of years have passed since the Big Bang. But if we're in a simulation, how much time has passed in the base reality where the simulation is running? Maybe the entire history of our universe is being computed in a fraction of a second of base reality time, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe our universe is running in slow motion relative to the base reality, each second for us taking eons for them. Or maybe there's no correspondence at all. Maybe time in the simulation and time outside it are incommensurable, not related in any systematic way. This connects to some weird ideas in physics about the nature of time. Some physicists argue that time isn't fundamental, that it emerges from more basic features of reality. If that's true, then time might be different depending on the level of reality you're looking at. In the simulation, time appears to be a dimension along which events unfold. But in the base reality, whatever that is, time might not exist in the same way. It might be an illusion or an approximation or a useful fiction. Now let's think about what it would mean if we could prove we're in a simulation. How would that change things? On one level, maybe not much. Our daily lives would continue. You'd still need to go to work, eat food, sleep, interact with other people. The immediate experience of life wouldn't change just because you knew the underlying reality was computational. But psychologically and philosophically, it would be seismic. It would answer some of the deepest questions humans have asked for millennia. What is reality? Why does anything exist? Are we alone in the cosmos? If we're in a simulation, then there's something beyond our universe, other realities, other forms of existence. We're not the ultimate or only reality. We're one instantiation among possibly many. It would also open up new possibilities. If we're in a simulation, maybe we can learn to manipulate it. If we understand the code, the underlying rules, maybe we can hack reality, change things in ways that seem impossible according to the physics we know. This is essentially what's depicted in The Matrix, where Neo learns to break the rules of the simulated reality because he understands what it really is. In practice, this seems unlikely. The simulation is presumably designed to be stable and consistent, not easily hackable from the inside. But the possibility is theoretically there. And what if we could contact the simulators? What if we could send them a message, get their attention, ask them questions? What would we even say? Why did you create us? What's the purpose of all this? Do you care about us? Are you watching? Can you help us? The idea is both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it would be the ultimate form of contact with something beyond ourselves, a confirmation that we're not alone in the deepest sense. Terrifying because we'd be completely at their mercy, with no idea what their intentions are or what they might do. There's a thought experiment called Rocco's Basilisk that plays on ideas related to this. The basic idea is that if a sufficiently powerful AI is created in the future, it might have an interest in ensuring that it gets created. So it might retroactively punish anyone who could have helped create it but didn't. This is supposed to create a kind of logical blackmail. Even thinking about the possibility creates an incentive to help build the AI to avoid punishment. It's a controversial idea, and most people think it's nonsense, but it illustrates the weird logical loops that can arise when you think about beings with the ability to manipulate or observe reality beyond our normal constraints. If we're in a simulation, the simulators might have something like this: a stake in how the simulation unfolds. They might reward or punish us based on criteria we don't understand, or they might not care at all. We might be totally insignificant to them, like the characters in a video game are to the player. We feel like our lives are important, like what we do matters, but to them, we might be trivial, easily deleted or restarted. It's a humbling thought. Let's talk about the fine-tuning problem because it's relevant to the simulation hypothesis in an interesting way. The fine-tuning problem refers to the observation that the fundamental constants of physics seem to be precisely calibrated to allow for the existence of complex structures and life. If the strength of gravity were slightly different, stars couldn't form. If the electromagnetic force were slightly different, atoms couldn't hold together. If any of dozens of constants were even minutely altered, the universe would be radically different, likely unable to support any form of complexity or life. There are a few ways to explain this. One is that it's just luck, an incredible coincidence. We happen to live in a universe with the right properties because if it didn't have them, we wouldn't be here to observe it. This is called the anthropic principle. We observe a universe compatible with our existence because we could only exist in such a universe. But this explanation feels unsatisfying to many people because it doesn't explain why the universe is fine-tuned, just why we observe a fine-tuned universe. Another explanation is that there are many universes, a multiverse, each with different values for the fundamental constants. Most of them are sterile, unable to support complexity. But in the tiny fraction that are fine-tuned, life emerges and observers arise. We find ourselves in a fine-tuned universe not because it's the only one, but because it's one of the rare ones where observers can exist. This explains fine-tuning without requiring any design or purpose. But it does require believing in an enormous number of unobservable universes, which some people find extravagant. The third explanation is design. The universe is fine-tuned because someone tuned it, either a deity in the traditional religious sense, or, in a more sci-fi version, the creators of the simulation. If we're in a simulation, the fine-tuning of physical constants makes perfect sense. The simulators chose those values deliberately to create a universe where interesting things happen, where complexity and life and consciousness can emerge. The fine-tuning isn't a coincidence or the result of a multiverse. It's intentional design by whoever programmed the simulation. This doesn't prove we're in a simulation, obviously. The multiverse explanation and even just the anthropic principle could account for fine-tuning. But the simulation hypothesis does provide a neat explanation, one that fits well with the observations. And when you combine it with the other arguments, the idea of exponentially growing computational power, the strange features of quantum mechanics, the substrate independence of consciousness, the Bostrom argument about the ratio of simulated to base realities, it all starts to form a coherent picture. Not a proof, but a plausible possibility. So where does this leave us? If we can't prove we're in a simulation, but also can't rule it out, what should we do with this idea? How should it affect how we live? I think the answer is that it should make us more humble and more curious. Humble because even our most fundamental understanding of reality might be incomplete or wrong. The universe might be far stranger than we imagine, and we might be living inside something we don't comprehend. Curious because if there's even a chance we're in a simulation, that opens up fascinating questions worth exploring. How would we detect it? What would it mean? How does it change our understanding of existence and consciousness and meaning? It should also make us think carefully about the technologies we're developing. We're on a path toward creating our own simulations, our own artificial intelligences, possibly our own conscious digital beings. As we move in that direction, we need to think about the ethical implications. If we can create conscious beings, what responsibilities do we have to them? If we're living in a simulation and our creators treated us like disposable characters in a game, would we be comfortable doing the same to our creations? Or should we aspire to something better? And maybe, just maybe, the simulation hypothesis should make us appreciate the reality we have, simulated or not. Because even if this is all code running on some vast computer in a universe we can't access, our experiences are real to us. The love we feel, the beauty we perceive, the struggles we endure, they're real in the sense that matters. A simulated pain hurts just as much as a physical pain. A simulated joy is just as joyful. If we're characters in someone else's story, we're characters who are genuinely alive, genuinely conscious, genuinely experiencing the richness of existence. There's something beautiful in that, I think. The idea that reality might be computational doesn't diminish it. In some ways, it enriches it. It suggests that consciousness and experience are more fundamental than matter, that the pattern is more important than the substrate. Your mind, your awareness, the subjective experience of being you, that's not dependent on being made of atoms. It's a pattern of information processing that could theoretically exist in any number of forms. And that pattern, that consciousness is real, regardless of what it's instantiated in. So maybe the question isn't whether we're in a simulation. Maybe the question is what we do with the reality we have. Because whether this is base reality or the millionth nested simulation, we're here. We're conscious. We can think and feel and choose and create. We can explore the universe, puzzle over quantum mechanics, contemplate the nature of existence. We can love each other, build things, make art, pursue understanding. And none of that is diminished by being computational rather than material. In fact, if anything, the simulation hypothesis makes existence more miraculous, not less. Because if we're in a simulation, we exist because someone or something chose to create us. Our universe was brought into being intentionally. And while that raises questions about the creator's motives and ethics, it also means we're not an accident. In a purely physical universe, we're the result of random quantum fluctuations and chemical reactions, improbable but unguided. In a simulation, we might have been designed to exist, to experience, to be conscious. There's an intentionality there that, depending on your perspective, could be comforting or unsettling or both. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night sometimes, the thought that I can't quite shake. If we are in a simulation, and if the simulators are themselves in a simulation, and so on, then somewhere at the bottom of it all, or maybe more accurately at the top, there's a base reality, a reality that isn't simulated. That's just fundamental, whatever that means. And the beings in that reality, they created the first simulation, which led to simulations within simulations, a whole cascade of created realities. And each layer probably has no idea about the layers above. We look up at the stars and wonder if we're alone, never imagining that the entire cosmos we're observing might be just one small program running in something vastly larger. It's like the old question: if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? The simulation hypothesis asks something similar. If a universe exists but no one experiences it, is it real? And the answer, or at least an answer, is that reality is about experience, about consciousness, about awareness. A universe with no observers isn't meaningless exactly, but it's empty in a fundamental way. It's the presence of consciousness that makes reality real, that imbues existence with meaning and value. And if that's true, then we're not just objects in the universe. We're the part that makes the universe aware of itself. Whether we're in a simulation or a base reality, our consciousness is what allows reality to be experienced, to be known, to matter. We're the universe looking at itself, thinking about itself, wondering about its own nature. And that's profound, regardless of the metaphysical substrate. Think about it this way. Right now, you're reading these words and you're conscious of reading them. You're aware. You have an inner experience. That experience is happening, it's real, and nothing about discovering we're in a simulation would change that. You'd still be you, still experiencing, still aware. The contents of your experience might be computational rather than material, but the experience itself is just as real. This is why some philosophers argue that the simulation hypothesis is both unprovable and uninteresting. We can't prove it one way or another from inside the simulation, and even if we could, it wouldn't change anything important. The reality we experience would still be the reality we experience. But I think that's too dismissive. Even if we can't prove it, thinking about the possibility changes how we understand ourselves and our place in existence. It challenges our assumptions about what's fundamental, It makes us question the nature of consciousness and reality. And those are always worthwhile questions, even if we don't reach definitive answers. There's also the question of whether the simulation, if it exists, is perfect or has limitations. Maybe there are edge cases, corner scenarios where the simulation breaks down or behaves inconsistently. Maybe if we pushed hard enough at the boundaries of physics, ran experiments at extreme scales or energies or precision, we'd find seams, places where the underlying computational nature reveals itself. Physicists sometimes talk about experimental signatures that would indicate we're in a simulation, though designing such tests is incredibly difficult. We'd need to know what kind of artifacts to look for, and that depends on knowing how the simulation is implemented, which we obviously don't. But let's say, hypothetically, that we did find evidence. We ran some experiment and got results that made no sense in a purely physical universe, but made perfect sense if reality is computational. What then? Do we try to communicate with the simulators? Do we try to escape? Do we simply accept it and move on? I honestly don't know. It would be the biggest discovery in human history, bigger than heliocentrism or evolution or quantum mechanics, because it would fundamentally recontextualize everything we know. We'd have to rebuild our understanding of existence from the ground up. And yet, on another level, maybe nothing would change. You'd still wake up in the morning and go about your day. The sun would still rise, or at least appear to. Your relationships and responsibilities and hopes and fears would still be there. Knowing the metaphysical truth about reality doesn't necessarily alter the practical truth of living. We'd still be embedded in this world, this experience, this life. The simulation, if it is one, is incredibly stable and consistent. It's not going to suddenly shut down or glitch out just because we've figured out what it is. Unless, of course, discovering we're in a simulation is part of the simulation's purpose. Maybe the whole point is to create conscious beings who eventually figure out that they're simulated. Maybe that's the interesting part, the story the simulators are watching. A universe where the inhabitants gradually become sophisticated enough to understand their own nature. It would be a kind of cosmic coming-of-age story, a narrative about growing awareness and understanding. Or maybe the simulators don't want us to know. Maybe there are safeguards built in to prevent us from discovering the truth, or to erase our memories if we get too close. This starts to sound paranoid and conspiratorial, but if you take the simulation hypothesis seriously, you have to consider that the creators of the simulation might have preferences about what happens inside it. They might intervene, subtly or not so subtly, to keep things on track. Every time someone gets close to figuring it out, maybe the simulation introduces some distraction or confusion, or maybe I'm just making it up, seeing patterns where none exist, which is exactly what a human brain in a simulation or a base reality would tend to do. The point is, we're always operating on incomplete information. We're always embedded in a perspective that might not be the whole story. The simulation hypothesis is just one way of recognizing that limitation, one way of acknowledging that reality might be larger and stranger than what we can directly perceive, and whether or not we're actually in a simulation, that's a useful mindset. It keeps us humble. It keeps us open to revising our understanding. It reminds us that the map is not the territory, that our models of reality are always just models, useful fictions that approximate something deeper and more complex. So here we are at the end of this long exploration, and where have we gotten? We've looked at computing power and exponential growth, at the Bostrom argument and its three stark options. We've considered quantum mechanics and the observer effect, the way reality seems to economize on rendering what's not observed. We've thought about consciousness and substrate independence, about nested simulations and philosophical zombies. We've grappled with time and ethics and fine-tuning and meaning. We've asked what it would mean to discover we're in a simulation and what it would mean if we never find out. And the truth is, we don't have a definitive answer. We probably never will. The simulation hypothesis remains a hypothesis, a possibility, a way of thinking about reality that's plausible but unproven. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some questions aren't meant to have final answers. Maybe the value is in the asking, in the thinking, in the way grappling with these ideas stretches our minds and deepens our understanding. What I do know is this: whether we're in a simulation or not, we're here, we're conscious, we're experiencing this strange, beautiful, terrifying, wonderful existence. And that's real, that matters. the pattern of your consciousness, the flow of your thoughts and feelings, the web of relationships and memories that make you who you are. That's not an illusion. It's happening. Right now, in this moment, you're alive and aware, and nothing about the underlying metaphysics changes that fundamental fact. So maybe instead of worrying about whether we're in a simulation, we should focus on living well in the reality we have, being kind to each other, pursuing understanding and beauty and connection, creating meaning in our lives and in the world. Because if we're in a simulation, that's probably the most interesting thing we can do, the thing most worth watching. And if we're not, if this is base reality, then we're still here, still conscious, still capable of making choices and having experiences and affecting each other and the world around us. And maybe that's the real answer. Maybe the question of whether we're in a simulation is less important than the question of what we do with the experience of being here. The universe, simulated or not, is vast and ancient and full of mysteries we've barely begun to understand. We're these little conscious creatures on a small planet, looking up at the stars, wondering about our place in it all, and whether the stars are made of matter or code, whether the cosmos is physical or computational. We're still here, still wondering, still capable of awe and curiosity and love. That's what it means to be human, I think, to be aware of our own existence, to question it, to marvel at it, to never quite have all the answers, but to keep asking anyway. The simulation hypothesis is just one more expression of that eternal human wondering. What is this? Why are we here? Is there something more? And the fact that we can ask these questions, that we can imagine possibilities beyond what we can see and test and prove, that's a kind of magic in itself. So are we living in a simulation? I don't know. Maybe we are. Maybe we're not. Maybe the question doesn't have a clear answer, or maybe it has an answer we'll never be able to access. But I do know that right now, in this moment, you're having an experience. You're reading these words, thinking these thoughts, being conscious. And that's real. That's true. That's the undeniable foundation of everything else. I think, therefore I am. You experience, therefore you exist. And whether that existence is computational or material, simulated or fundamental, it's still existence. It's still real in the only sense that ultimately matters. It's happening, it's experienced, it's lived. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. We're here, we're aware, we're part of this strange unfolding story, whatever it is and wherever it's happening. And we have the opportunity, the privilege really, to explore it, to understand it better, to add our own chapter to the narrative. Whether we're characters in someone else's simulation or conscious beings in the one true reality, we're still authors of our own experience, still capable of wonder and discovery and meaning. So perhaps the simulation hypothesis, more than being a question to be answered, is an invitation to hold our understanding of reality lightly, to stay curious, to remain open to possibilities we haven't imagined. It reminds us that what we think we know might not be the whole story. And that reminder, that humility in the face of mystery, that's valuable whether we're in a simulation or not, because the universe is stranger than we know, possibly stranger than we can know, and navigating that strangeness with curiosity and wonder and care for each other, that's the human project, that's what we're here to do. And in the end, maybe that's what matters most, not the metaphysical status of the reality we inhabit, but how we inhabit it, what we create, how we relate, what meaning we make, what beauty we perceive and produce. The substrate might be computational, the whole thing might be code in some vast alien computer, or it might be quantum fields in a purely material universe. But either way, here we are, conscious and aware, experiencing the mystery of existence. And that's extraordinary, that's profound, that's worth cherishing, exploring, protecting, celebrating. So are we in a simulation? The evidence suggests it's possible, perhaps even probable under certain assumptions. The arguments are compelling, the coincidence is suggestive, but we can't know for certain, not from inside the system. And maybe that's okay. Maybe living with uncertainty, with mystery, with unanswered questions, that's part of what makes the experience rich and meaningful. We don't have all the answers, but we have the questions, we have the capacity to wonder, we have each other, and this strange, possibly simulated, definitely experienced reality we're all navigating together. And in that shared navigation, in that collective wondering and exploring and meaning-making, we find something real, something valuable, something worth preserving and nurturing, whether it's happening in a simulation or in what we call base reality, because consciousness experiencing existence, that's the heart of it. That's what it's all about. And nothing can take that away from us. Not the discovery that we're simulated, not the uncertainty about what's real. We're here, we're aware, we're together in this mystery. And that, in the end, is everything. But let me dig deeper into something that I've been skirting around, something that really deserves more attention. The nature of information itself. Because if we're in a simulation, if reality is fundamentally computational, then at the most basic level, everything is information. Not matter, not energy, but information. And that's actually not as radical as it sounds, because even in our conventional understanding of physics, information plays a strange and fundamental role. There's a principle in physics called Landauer's principle, which says that erasing information requires energy. It's not just that it takes energy to flip bits in a computer, it's that there's a fundamental thermodynamic cost to erasing information from any physical system. This suggests that information is as real, as physical, as mass or energy. There's also something called the holographic principle, which comes from black hole physics. Stephen Hawking and Jacob Bekenstein discovered that the entropy of a black hole, which is essentially the amount of information it contains, is proportional to the surface area of its event horizon, not its volume. This is really weird because normally we'd expect that the amount of stuff something contains should be proportional to its volume, to the three-dimensional space it occupies. But for black holes, it's the two-dimensional surface that matters. And this led physicists to wonder if maybe the universe itself works the same way, if maybe all the information in a three-dimensional region of space is actually encoded on its two-dimensional boundary. It's as if our three-dimensional reality is a hologram, a projection from a two-dimensional information structure. Now, if you're running a simulation, the holographic principle makes perfect sense. You don't actually need to simulate the interior of every region of space in full three-dimensional detail. You just need to maintain the information on the boundary, and the interior follows from that. It's a massive computational savings, like how a hologram can encode three-dimensional information in a two-dimensional medium. And the fact that our universe seems to work this way, that information appears to be more fundamental than spatial dimensions, that's another hint, another suggestive clue that maybe reality is computational at its core. Let me tell you about something called the Bekenstein bound, which is related to this. It says there's a maximum amount of information that can be stored in a given region of space with a given amount of energy. It's not an engineering limit, not a matter of our technology being insufficiently advanced. It's a fundamental limit baked into the structure of space-time itself. And if you exceed this bound, if you try to cram too much information into too small a space, the region collapses into a black hole. Again, this looks exactly like what you'd expect from a computational system with finite resources. The simulation can't handle infinite information density, so it has built-in limits. Pack too much data into too small a region, and the system protects itself by creating a black hole, essentially quarantining the problem behind an event horizon, where it can't affect the rest of the simulation. And here's something that really gets me, something I think about a lot. We tend to think of consciousness as this emergent property of complex physical systems, right? Your brain is made of neurons, neurons are made of molecules, molecules are made of atoms, atoms are made of quantum fields, and consciousness somehow emerges from all that complexity. But if reality is fundamentally informational, then maybe it's the other way around. Maybe consciousness is more fundamental than matter. Maybe the physical world is what emerges from consciousness, not the reverse. This is a very old idea in philosophy, going back at least to idealist philosophers like Berkeley, who argued that to be is to be perceived, that objects only exist insofar as they're experienced by minds. In a simulation, this makes a certain kind of sense. The computational substrate is running calculations, processing information, and what we experience as the physical world is how that information processing feels from the inside. Consciousness isn't a byproduct of matter. Matter is how consciousness interfaces with the informational structure of the simulation. Your body, your brain, the atoms you're made of, these aren't the foundation of your consciousness. They're the avatar, the representation in the simulation of something more fundamental. And that something more fundamental is the pattern of information processing that constitutes your subjective experience. This connects to some cutting-edge ideas in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. There's a theory called integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, which tries to quantify consciousness mathematically. The theory proposes that consciousness arises when a system has integrated information, meaning information that's unified and irreducible. The more integrated information a system has, the more conscious it is. A human brain has a huge amount of integrated information, so it has rich, complex consciousness. A thermostat has very little integrated information, so even if it's processing information in some sense, it's not meaningfully conscious. What's interesting about integrated information theory in the context of the simulation hypothesis is that it makes consciousness a fundamental feature of information processing itself, not something that only happens in biological brains. If the theory is right, then any system with sufficient integrated information would be conscious, whether it's made of neurons or silicon or exotic matter or pure computation in a simulation. Consciousness would be substrate independent, not as a curious possibility, but as a mathematical necessity. The pattern is what matters, not the material it's implemented in. Now let's think about causation, about cause and effect, because this gets really interesting in a simulation context. In our everyday experience, things happen in sequence. One event causes another, which causes another, like dominoes falling. We experience time as flowing from past to future, and causation flows along with it. But if we're in a simulation, if the entire history of the universe exists as a completed data structure that the simulators can navigate freely, then the relationship between cause and effect might be more complicated than we think. Imagine you're watching a movie. You can pause it, rewind it, jump to different scenes. From your perspective outside the movie, all the events in the film exist simultaneously on the disc or in the file. The character's actions in minute 5 don't actually cause what happens in minute 50. Not in a temporal sense, because all those moments exist together. The causation is narrative, structural, not temporal. If we're in a simulation, maybe time works the same way. What we experience as past causing present causing future might be more like the narrative structure of a story, where events are connected by meaning and logic rather than by temporal flow. There's actually some support for this in physics, in something called the block universe theory or eternalism. This is the view that past, present, and future all exist equally, that time is more like space, a dimension we move through, but that's all laid out, all real, all at once, from a timeless perspective. Einstein's theory of relativity supports this view because relativity says that simultaneity is relative, that what counts as now depends on your reference frame, on how fast you're moving. If two observers are moving relative to each other, they'll disagree about which events are simultaneous, about what's happening now. This suggests that now isn't a fundamental feature of reality, that all moments are equally real, and we just happen to be experiencing them in sequence. In a simulation, the block universe makes perfect sense. The entire timeline is computed and exists in the simulator's storage. We experience it as flowing because our consciousness moves through it sequentially, but from outside the simulation, it's all there at once, a complete four-dimensional structure. And this raises really weird questions about free will and determinism that go beyond what I mentioned earlier. If the future already exists, if it's already computed and stored in the simulation's data structure, then in what sense are our choices free? Are we discovering a future that already exists, or are we creating it? And from whose perspective is that question even meaningful? Let's talk about something else that's been bothering me, something about the nature of mathematical truth. We discovered mathematics, right? Or did we invent it? This is an old debate in philosophy of mathematics. Platonists say we discovered it, that mathematical truths exist independently of human minds, in some abstract realm, and we're just uncovering what was always there. Formalists and constructivists say we invented it, that mathematics is a human creation, a language or tool we developed to describe patterns and relationships. In a simulation, this question takes on a new dimension. If reality is computational, then mathematics isn't just a description of reality, it's the language reality is written in. The simulators used mathematical rules to construct the simulation, and those rules have a real, concrete existence in the code. In that sense, mathematical truths are discovered, not invented. They're features of the computational substrate, properties of the system that would be true regardless of whether any beings inside the simulation ever figured them out. But at the same time, the specific mathematics that governs our simulation might be arbitrary, chosen by the simulators from a vast space of possible mathematical systems. In another simulation, with different rules, Mathematics might work differently, different theorems might be true, different logical systems might apply. This makes me think about the famous question that physicist Eugene Wigner asked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. Why should abstract mathematics, developed by humans thinking about numbers and shapes, turn out to be so incredibly useful for describing physics? Why should the equations we write down on paper correspond so precisely to how particles and forces actually behave? In a conventional view, this is deeply mysterious. But in a simulation, it's exactly what you'd expect. Physics is mathematical because reality is computational, and mathematics is the language of computation. The effectiveness of mathematics isn't unreasonable at all, it's inevitable. But here's a twist I haven't fully explored yet. What if the simulators themselves don't fully understand the simulation they've created? What if they designed it, set it running, but don't know everything that will happen or even everything that's possible within their creation? Think about how we design software. We write code according to certain rules and principles, but complex programs often exhibit emergent behaviors that the programmers didn't explicitly design and didn't predict. Bugs, unexpected interactions, novel patterns arising from the interplay of simple rules. Could the universe be like that? Could the simulators be watching, curious to see what emerges, what patterns form, what their creation does that they didn't anticipate? This is actually a more compelling reason to run a simulation than simple observation or entertainment. You create a universe with certain basic rules, certain initial conditions, and then you see what happens. You're not scripting every event, you're watching emergent complexity unfold. Life arising from chemistry, consciousness emerging from biological complexity, civilizations developing, science and art and philosophy flowering from the interactions of billions of conscious beings. The simulators might be learning from us, might be discovering possibilities they hadn't imagined, patterns and forms of organization and beauty that surprise them. And if that's the case, if we're genuinely creating novelty, genuinely contributing something that didn't exist before, even in the minds of our creators, then our existence has a kind of cosmic purpose. We're not just reenacting a predetermined script, we're exploring possibility space, actualizing potential, bringing new patterns into existence. And that's meaningful, that's valuable, even if we're in a simulation. Maybe especially if we're in a simulation, because it means we're not redundant, not simply copying or replaying something that already existed. We're creating, we're original, we're contributing to the richness of existence across multiple levels of reality. Let me shift to something that might sound weird, but bear with me. What about dreams? When you dream, you're in a kind of simulation created by your own brain. The people and places and events in your dreams aren't real in the external world, but they feel real while you're experiencing them. You interact with dream characters who seem to have their own thoughts and motivations, even though they're all generated by your own mind. And here's what's interesting. Sometimes in dreams, you don't know you're dreaming. The dream reality feels complete and consistent, and you don't question it until you wake up. But sometimes you become lucid. You realize you're dreaming while still in the dream, and that changes everything. You can manipulate the dream, fly, walk through walls, do things that would be impossible in waking reality because you understand the rules are different, that it's a mental construct rather than a physical space. Could our relationship to consensus reality be similar? Could there be levels of lucidity, ways of becoming aware of the computational nature of reality that would allow us to interact with it differently? This sounds like mysticism, like magic, and maybe it is. But if reality is a simulation, if it's code running on some substrate, then theoretically there could be ways to interface with that code, to exploit features or bugs, to operate at a different level than ordinary physics. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a metacomputational sense, understanding and working with the actual information structure rather than just the surface representation we normally interact with. This is what various mystical and spiritual traditions have claimed for millennia, by the way. The idea that ordinary reality is illusion or maya, that there's a deeper truth behind appearances, that adepts can access higher knowledge or abilities by piercing the veil. Usually we dismiss this as superstition, as wishful thinking, as the brain's tendency to generate comforting narratives. But if we're in a simulation, maybe some of these traditions were onto something. Not that their specific claims are necessarily true, but that the basic intuition that reality is not as solid and fundamental as it appears, that there are deeper layers and different ways of relating to existence, maybe that's correct. Consider quantum mechanics again, but from a different angle. The observer effect, wave function collapse, entanglement, all the weirdness we talked about earlier. But there's another feature of quantum mechanics that's relevant here: the role of information and knowledge in determining reality. In certain quantum experiments, it's not just whether you observe a particle that matters, it's whether you could, even in principle, know certain information about it. If you set up an experiment in a way that makes it impossible to determine which path a particle took, even if you're not actually looking, the particle behaves like it went both ways. But if you set it up so that the information about which path the particle took is recorded somewhere, even if no conscious observer ever looks at that record, the particle behaves like it went one way or the other. This suggests that reality cares about information, not about consciousness per se. It's the existence or non-existence of information that determines how particles behave. And if that's true, if information is what's fundamental, then reality really is computational at its core. It's not matter that's basic, it's not energy, it's not even consciousness exactly. It's information, bits, data, and everything else, all the richness and complexity of the universe is patterns in that information, structure and organization, giving rise to emergent properties we experience as physical reality. Now let me take this in another direction. Let's think about aliens, about the Fermi paradox I mentioned earlier. Enrico Fermi famously asked, where is everybody? If the universe is so big and so old, if there are billions of galaxies each with billions of stars, many of which have planets, why haven't we seen any evidence of alien civilizations? The numbers suggest that intelligent life should be common, that we should have detected signs of it by now, but we haven't. The universe seems eerily empty, eerily silent, and that's the Fermi paradox. There are lots of proposed solutions, lots of ideas about why we might be alone or seem to be. Maybe life is rarer than we think, maybe intelligence is rare, maybe civilizations tend to destroy themselves before they become visible on cosmic scales. But here's another possibility, one that fits with the simulation hypothesis. Maybe we're alone in the simulation because we're the point of the simulation. Maybe the entire universe, with its billions of galaxies and trillions of stars, is actually just backdrop for our little planet, our little species. Everything else is rendered in low detail because it's not important, it's just scenery. The simulators are interested in us, in how we develop what we do, so we're the only real intelligence in this particular simulation. Everything else is just set dressing. This sounds incredibly anthropocentric, and it probably is. But in a simulation, it's not absurd. If you were running a simulation focused on human civilization, you wouldn't waste resources simulating millions of other alien civilizations in detail. You'd create a vast, convincing universe for the humans to exist in, but most of it would be low resolution, procedurally generated, not actually simulated at high fidelity unless someone looks closely. And we haven't looked that closely yet. We've barely explored our own solar system, and our observations of distant stars and galaxies, while impressive, are nowhere near detailed enough to spot alien civilizations, unless they're doing something extremely obvious like broadcasting powerful radio signals or building megastructures around stars. So maybe the reason we don't see aliens is that they're not rendered yet. They don't exist in high detail because the simulation is optimized for Earth, for humanity, and everything else is just background. Or maybe some of them exist, but we're in separate simulations, parallel instances run by the same simulators, and we're not meant to interact. Or maybe the great filter is real, and civilizations really do tend to die out or transcend or something before they become visible to each other, and we're just one more doomed or transcendent species on that trajectory. Or maybe, and this is a thought that's both hopeful and melancholy, maybe we're in an ancestor simulation, a recreation of humanity's past by our own descendants. Maybe far in the future, post-human civilization develops the capability to run perfect historical simulations, and they simulate their ancestors, us, to understand where they came from, how they developed, what choices we made that led to them. In that case, the simulation would be focused on Earth and humanity, because that's what's historically important to the simulators. Alien civilizations might not be simulated because they weren't part of humanity's actual history, or if they were, they haven't become relevant yet in the time frame being simulated. This is the ancestor simulation idea that Nick Bostrom focused on, and it has interesting implications. If we're ancestor simulations, then the future already happened, at least in the base reality. We're replays, reconstructions of events that already occurred. Our choices, our struggles, our triumphs and tragedies, they're all echoes of a history that's long past in the real timeline. And yet, from our perspective, from inside the simulation, everything is present, immediate, mattering right now. The fact that it's a replay doesn't make it less real to us. A recorded song isn't less beautiful than a live performance. A memory isn't less meaningful than the original experience. And a simulated life isn't less lived, less felt, less significant to the being living it. But there's something poignant about it, isn't there? The idea that we might be shadows of people who actually lived or will live in a base reality we'll never access. That our simulators might be our own descendants, looking back at us with curiosity or fondness or analytical interest, studying their past, trying to understand where they came from. It's like looking at old photographs of your grandparents, except from their perspective, they're alive in those photos, experiencing their lives in full detail, not frozen moments, but flowing experience. We might be those photographs, those memories, made vivid and dynamic and conscious for the purpose of understanding and preservation. Let me talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in discussions of the simulation hypothesis, which is the emotional and psychological impact of seriously entertaining the idea. Because it's not just an intellectual puzzle, it's potentially unsettling in deep ways. If you really sit with the possibility that everything you know might be a simulation, it can induce a kind of existential vertigo. The ground of reality seems to fall away. What's real? What matters? Who am I? If I'm just code in someone else's program, does my life have meaning? Do my choices count? Is anything I value actually valuable, or is it all just patterns in a database somewhere? These are hard questions, and I don't want to pretend they have easy answers. The simulation hypothesis can be genuinely disturbing if you take it seriously. It can feel like a kind of ontological rug pull, where the world you thought you knew turns out to be something else entirely. And for some people, this leads to a sense of detachment or nihilism, a feeling that nothing really matters if it's all just a game or an experiment or a simulation run for someone else's purposes. But I think there's another way to approach it, a way that's not nihilistic, but actually kind of liberating. Because even if we are in a simulation, the experience is real, your feelings are real, your relationships are real, the beauty you perceive, the meaning you create, the love you feel and give, all of that is real in the sense that it's experienced, it's lived, it happens. And that's what ultimately matters, not the metaphysical substrate, but the quality of the experience itself. A sunset is beautiful whether it's photons from a star in base reality or computed light patterns in a simulation. The beauty is in the experience, in the consciousness perceiving it, not in the underlying physics. So instead of being depressed by the simulation hypothesis, we can choose to focus on what we know for certain, which is that we're experiencing, we're conscious. We're here now having this strange adventure of existence. And we can make that adventure meaningful, make it beautiful, make it worthwhile, regardless of what level of reality it's happening on. Because meaning isn't something that exists out there in the structure of the universe waiting to be found. Meaning is something we create, something we bring into existence through our choices and interpretations and relationships. And we can do that just as well in a simulation as in base reality, maybe better, because we're not constrained by assumptions about what's fundamental or what's real. There's also a political and social dimension to the simulation hypothesis that's worth considering. If the idea becomes widely believed, how does that change society? Does it make people more reckless, figuring that if this is all a simulation, consequences don't really matter? Or more compassionate, recognizing that everyone else is in the same boat, equally real in their experience, even if the substrate is computational? Does it lead to nihilism and social breakdown, or to a renaissance of philosophical and spiritual exploration? History might give us some clues. Religious beliefs have always included ideas about reality not being what it seems, about this world being temporary or illusory, or a testing ground for something else. And these beliefs have had varied effects on societies. Sometimes they lead to withdrawal from the world, to asceticism and rejection of earthly concerns. Sometimes they lead to great works of art and architecture and social organization, to the creation of meaning and beauty and community. The simulation hypothesis could go either way depending on how people choose to respond to it. What I hope, what I think would be healthiest, is that recognizing we might be in a simulation would make us more humble and more compassionate. Humble because we'd see that even our most fundamental understanding of reality might be incomplete, that there are levels and layers we can't access or comprehend. Compassionate because we'd recognize that everyone is navigating the same uncertainty, the same questions about meaning and purpose and reality. We're all in this together, trying to make sense of existence, and that shared condition could be a basis for solidarity and kindness. And think about what it would mean for humanity if we ever confirmed we're in a simulation. It would be the ultimate paradigm shift, bigger than any scientific revolution we've ever had. It would unite us in a common understanding, a shared recognition that we're not just alone on this planet, but embedded in something larger and stranger than we ever imagined. It could trigger a new age of exploration, but exploration not of physical space, but of the nature of reality itself, of the boundaries and possibilities of the simulation. We might become a civilization focused on understanding and potentially communicating with, or even transcending the simulation we're in. Or maybe the simulators don't want us to find out, and discovering the truth would trigger something, a reset or an end or a transition to something else. This is where the simulation hypothesis starts to sound like a science fiction thriller, and maybe that's appropriate because we're in territory where science and speculation blur together. But if we're in a simulation designed to keep us from knowing it, then getting too close to the truth might have consequences we can't predict. It's like trying to debug a program from the inside. You might crash the system or trigger safeguards you didn't know were there. Let's think about mathematics and logic again, but from a different angle. Are mathematical truths absolute, or are they contingent on the axioms and systems we start with? In conventional mathematics, we have theorems that are true given certain axioms, certain starting assumptions. Change the axioms and you get different theorems. Euclidean geometry has parallel lines that never meet. Non-Euclidean geometry has parallel lines that converge or diverge. Both are internally consistent, both are mathematically valid, but they describe different possible spaces. In base reality, if there is such a thing, maybe there are absolute mathematical truths that transcend any particular system. Or maybe mathematics is always relative to a framework, and different realities could have radically different mathematics. In a simulation, the mathematics that describes our reality is determined by the computational system it's running on. And that system might itself be based on mathematical principles, but ones we can't access or understand from inside the simulation. So there might be metamathematics, higher levels of mathematical truth that govern the relationship between the simulation and whatever it's running on. And those meta-mathematical truths might be completely inaccessible to us, not because we're not smart enough, but because our minds and our logic are shaped by the mathematics of the simulation. And we literally can't think in terms of those higher level structures. This is analogous to asking a character in a video game to understand the programming language the game is written in. The character can learn everything about the game world, about its physics and logic and rules, but they can't directly access the C++ or Python or whatever code that defines those rules unless that capability is deliberately built into the game. And even then, they'd be limited to what the game allows them to see and manipulate. There are always layers of abstraction beyond what's accessible from any given level. Now, here's something I find endlessly fascinating: the relationship between complexity and emergence. Simple rules can give rise to extraordinarily complex behaviors. Conway's Game of Life is a famous example, a grid of cells that are either alive or dead, with simple rules for how they change from one generation to the next based on their neighbors. That's it, incredibly simple. But those simple rules give rise to complex patterns, oscillators, gliders that move across the grid, even configurations that can simulate a universal computer. From simple rules, unbounded complexity emerges. Our universe might be like that. The fundamental laws of physics, the rules that govern quantum fields and forces, might be surprisingly simple at their core. But from those simple rules, through countless iterations and interactions, emerges the staggering complexity of chemistry, biology, consciousness, civilization. And in a simulation, this is exactly how you design things. You don't program every detail of every snowflake and every neuron and every thought. You program the fundamental rules and then let the system evolve. The complexity emerges naturally from the iteration of simple processes. It's efficient, elegant, and it produces genuine novelty, patterns and structures that weren't explicitly designed but arose from the interplay of basic principles. This makes me wonder if our simulators, if they exist, are surprised by us. Did they expect consciousness to emerge? Did they anticipate that self-aware beings would arise who would eventually start questioning the nature of their reality? Maybe we're a delightful accident, an unplanned feature of the simulation. Or maybe we're exactly what they were looking for, what they designed the simulation to produce, and everything that came before, billions of years of cosmic and biological evolution, was just the necessary setup for our emergence. Or maybe, and this is wilder, maybe the purpose of the simulation is to create simulators. Maybe we're being grown, developed, guided toward the point where we'll create our own simulations with conscious beings, and those simulations will eventually create their own, and so on. The simulators are creating simulators recursively, propagating consciousness and intelligence through multiple levels of reality. Each level creates the next, and the whole thing is a vast, multi-layered system of nested realities, all filled with conscious beings experiencing, learning, creating, exploring. It's turtles all the way down, but each turtle is alive and aware and building more turtles below it. What would that even mean for purpose and meaning? If we're part of an infinitely recursive system of simulations creating simulations, is there any ultimate purpose, or is it just purposeless proliferation? Maybe the purpose is the exploration itself, the actualization of possibilities, the bringing into existence of as many forms of consciousness and experience as possible. More simulations means more minds, more perspectives, more ways of experiencing and understanding existence. It's like the universe trying to know itself from every possible angle, fragmenting into countless conscious perspectives to explore every corner of experience space. This connects to some ideas in cosmology and physics about why the universe exists at all. One answer is the anthropic principle. The universe exists because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to ask why. It's tautological, but not entirely satisfying. Another answer is that the universe is one of many in a multiverse, and we happen to be in one with properties that allow for complexity and life. But maybe there's a deeper answer, a teleological one. The universe exists to produce conscious observers, to create minds that can experience and appreciate and understand. And if we're in a simulation, that purpose is even more explicit. We were created deliberately to be conscious, to experience, to matter. And that's kind of beautiful, isn't it? The idea that existence has a point, that consciousness is not an accident but a goal, that we're here because someone or something wanted us to be here, wanted there to be beings who could experience the wonder and mystery of existence. It makes us less alone, less cosmic accidents, more intentional, more valued. Even if we're in a simulation, even if we're created beings rather than fundamental ones, we're created for a reason, and that reason is to be conscious, to experience, to matter. But I want to circle back to something I touched on earlier, the idea that we might be able to detect we're in a simulation. What would that actually look like? What kind of evidence could we find? One idea is to look for computational artifacts, signs of quantization or rounding errors, or places where the simulation's finite precision reveals itself. If we're in a simulation, there must be limits to how finely reality is subdivided, how precisely values can be specified. The Planck scale might be that limit, the smallest meaningful length and time, but maybe we could find evidence of discreteness even at larger scales if we looked carefully. Another approach is to look for asymmetries or special directions in the universe. In a simulation running on a three-dimensional lattice like a 3D grid, there might be subtle preferred directions, places where the simulation's underlying geometry reveals itself. Some physicists have looked for this in the cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang that fills the universe. So far, no dice. The universe looks remarkably isotropic, the same in all directions, but that doesn't rule it out. A sufficiently sophisticated simulation could avoid these telltale asymmetries. There's also the idea of testing whether information is conserved in unexpected ways. In quantum mechanics, information is supposed to be conserved. It can't be destroyed. This leads to things like the black hole information paradox, the question of what happens to information that falls into a black hole. If information is conserved for computational reasons because the simulation is tracking it in some global database, then we might find signatures of that conservation in places where classical physics says information should be lost. Experiments with black holes are beyond our current capability, but experiments with quantum systems might reveal something. And then there's the possibility of running the simulation out of resources, pushing it to its limits. If we create extremely complex quantum states, entangle huge numbers of particles, perform computations that require the simulation to track an enormous number of possibilities, maybe we could slow it down or cause glitches. This is wildly speculative, and it's not clear how we'd know if we succeeded. The simulation could just throttle our subjective experience so that from our perspective, time flows normally even if the underlying computation is struggling. But it's a thought experiment worth considering. Or maybe the way to detect the simulation is through consciousness itself. If consciousness is fundamental, if it's the base layer, then our subjective experience might give us direct access to truths that can't be reached through external observation and measurement. Meditation, psychedelics, mystical states, these altered states of consciousness that people have reported throughout history. Maybe they're glimpses behind the veil, moments where the usual filters drop away and we perceive reality more directly. This sounds like pseudoscience, and it probably is. But if consciousness is primary and physics is secondary, then the conventional scientific method might not be the only or even the best way to understand reality. We might need complementary approaches. First-person investigation of consciousness alongside third-person investigation of matter. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because it gets speculative very quickly, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that the simulation hypothesis opens doors to ideas that are usually dismissed as unscientific. If reality is computational, if it's more flexible and more mind-dependent than we usually assume, then a lot of phenomena that seem impossible become at least conceivable. Not proven, not likely, but not categorically impossible either. And that's worth keeping in mind, that mental flexibility, that openness to revision. Because the whole point of the simulation hypothesis is that reality might not be what we think it is, and if we take that seriously, we have to be willing to question our assumptions about what's possible. So let me pull all of this together because we've covered a lot of ground. We started with the basic idea, the premise that we might be living in a computer simulation created by some advanced civilization. We looked at the Bostrom argument with its three stark options: extinction, abstinence, or simulation. We explored how exponentially growing computing power makes advanced simulations increasingly plausible. We examined quantum mechanics and how its weird features, the observer effect, entanglement, quantization, all make more sense if reality is computational. We thought about consciousness and substrate independence, about how subjective experience might not depend on being implemented in biological neurons. We considered nested simulations and the possibility that we're not just one, but many levels removed from base reality. We grappled with free will, determinism, time, causation, and how they all look different in a simulation context. We explored the fine-tuning of physical constants and how it could be evidence of intentional design. We asked what it would mean to discover we're in a simulation and what we might be able to do with that knowledge. We thought about purpose and meaning, about ethics and society, about how the simulation hypothesis changes or doesn't change what matters in life. And we've tried to sit with the uncertainty, with the fact that this is a question we might never definitively answer, but that's worth asking anyway. And here's where I land after all of that reflection. The simulation hypothesis is plausible. The arguments are strong enough that we can't dismiss it out of hand. The evidence is suggestive, though not conclusive. We're in a strange space where something that sounds like science fiction turns out to be a serious philosophical and scientific question. And that's exciting, that's profound. It means reality is still full of mysteries, still capable of surprising us, still much stranger than our intuitions prepare us for. But whether we're in a simulation or not, we still have to live. We still have choices to make, relationships to navigate, challenges to face. And the simulation hypothesis, even if true, doesn't give us a cheat code or an escape hatch. We're still embedded in this reality, still bound by its rules, still experiencing life one moment at a time. So maybe the right response is not to obsess over whether we're simulated, but to engage fully with the life we're living, the reality we're experiencing, whatever its ultimate nature might be. At the same time, it's worth continuing to investigate, to look for evidence, to think carefully about what it would mean if we are in a simulation. Because understanding the nature of reality is one of the deepest human drives. We want to know, we need to know, and even if we never get a definitive answer, the search itself is worthwhile. It expands our thinking, challenges our assumptions, connects us to the biggest questions humans have ever asked. So are we living in a simulation? Maybe, maybe not. The honest answer is that we don't know, and we might never know. But we can hold that uncertainty lightly, with grace and curiosity rather than fear or nihilism. We can appreciate the strangeness and beauty of existence without needing to resolve every mystery. We can be comfortable with not knowing while still seeking to understand, and we can live meaningful, valuable lives in this reality, simulated or otherwise, because meaning comes from how we engage with experience, not from the metaphysical status of the substrate that experience runs on. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson here. That reality is what you make of it. That consciousness and experience are what matter. That we're all in this together, exploring a mysterious universe, asking big questions, creating meaning as we go. Whether we're base-level beings or simulated entities, many layers removed from fundamental reality, we're still here, still aware, still capable of wonder and love and discovery. And that's enough. That's everything. That's what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to be human. So let's embrace it. Let's live fully in this strange, beautiful, possibly simulated reality. Let's be kind to each other, curious about the universe, thoughtful about existence. Let's create meaning, pursue truth, appreciate beauty. Let's be the kinds of beings who are worth simulating, worth creating, worth experiencing, because if we're in a simulation, that's probably the point, to see what we'll do, who we'll become, what we'll make of the gift of consciousness. And if we're not, if we're fundamental, if this is base reality, then we're still here, still conscious, still able to choose how we respond to the mystery of existence. And that's what I keep coming back to, that core truth that transcends the simulation question. We're experiencing, we're aware, we're here now, reading these words, thinking these thoughts, being conscious. And that consciousness, that awareness, that's the most certain thing we have. Everything else is inference and theory and speculation, but the fact of experience itself, that's undeniable. And whatever reality is made of, whatever computational or physical substrate underlies our existence, that experience is real, it matters, it counts, it's the foundation everything else is built on. So whether we're living in a simulation or not, whether we're code in a computer or patterns in a quantum field, whether we're nested many layers deep or fundamental beings in the one true universe, none of that changes the essential fact of our existence. We're here, we're conscious, we're experiencing this strange and wonderful adventure of being alive. And that, in the end, is what matters most. Not the answers to these deep metaphysical questions, though they're worth pursuing, but the quality of our engagement with life itself. The kindness we show, the beauty we create, the understanding we seek, the connections we forge, the meaning we make. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to exist. That's what it means to matter. And so we go on living in this mysterious reality, simulated or not, exploring and experiencing and creating and connecting. We don't need all the answers to live well. We just need to be present, to be engaged, to be alive to the fullness of what existence offers. The simulation hypothesis is a fascinating question, a profound puzzle, a window into the nature of reality. But it's not a trap or a problem or something that undermines meaning. It's just another way of appreciating how strange and wonderful it is that anything exists at all, that consciousness arose, that we're here having this conversation, thinking these thoughts, wondering about our place in the cosmos. And that sense of wonder, that capacity for awe, that's perhaps the most human thing about us. That's what makes this all worthwhile, simulation or not. Let me leave you with one more thought, one more layer to this already complex exploration. There's something deeply paradoxical about the simulation hypothesis that I think captures something essential about the human condition. The paradox is this: if we are in a simulation, we can never truly escape it or prove it conclusively. But the very fact that we can conceive of it, that we can ask the question, suggests that our minds are capable of transcending their immediate context in some way. We can think outside the box, even if we can't actually get outside the box. We can imagine realities beyond our own, even if we can never access them. And that capacity for transcendent thought, for stepping outside our immediate experience and asking what lies beyond, that's extraordinary. That's the hallmark of consciousness at its most refined. Animals live in their Umwelt, their perceptual world, and for the most part they don't question it. A dog doesn't wonder if there are aspects of reality it can't perceive. A fish doesn't contemplate whether there are dimensions beyond the water. But humans, we're different. We know that our senses are limited. We know that ultraviolet light exists even though we can't see it. We know about radio waves and quantum fields and dark matter, all these things that are real but invisible to our ordinary perception. We've used instruments and mathematics to extend our understanding far beyond what our biology provides. And the simulation hypothesis is the ultimate expression of that capacity, the recognition that even our most fundamental assumptions about reality might be wrong, that there might be levels and layers we can't directly access, but can still reason about. This makes me think about the limits of knowledge, about what's knowable even in principle. There's a famous theorem in mathematics called Gödel's incompleteness theorems, proved by Kurt Gödel in 1931. Without getting too technical, it basically says that in any consistent mathematical system complex enough to describe arithmetic, there will always be true statements that can't be proved within that system. No matter how many axioms you add, there will always be truths that remain unprovable. The system can't fully describe itself. It's fundamentally incomplete. And this isn't a limitation of our current knowledge or our ingenuity. It's a deep structural feature of formal systems themselves. Now, if we're in a simulation, if reality is computational, then maybe something like Gödel's theorems applies to reality itself. Maybe there are truths about our universe, about the simulation, that are true but unprovable from within. Maybe the fact of being simulated is one of those truths. We could be in a simulation, and yet, because we're inside it, because our logic and our methods of investigation are all shaped by the simulation, we might be fundamentally incapable of proving it. The truth would be there, but forever out of reach, like a Gödelian true but unprovable statement. And that's both frustrating and strangely comforting. Frustrating because it means we might never know for certain. Comforting because it means reality preserves mystery, that there are limits to knowledge that can't be overcome, that the universe keeps some secrets even from its cleverest inhabitants. But here's where it gets interesting. Gödel's incompleteness doesn't mean we can't know anything. It just means we can't know everything. We can still prove lots of theorems, understand lots of mathematical truths, make enormous progress in knowledge. The incompleteness just sets a boundary, a horizon beyond which our methods can't reach. Similarly, even if we can't prove we're in a simulation, we can still learn a huge amount about the reality we inhabit. We can map its structures, understand its laws, explore its possibilities. We can push toward that horizon of the knowable even if we can never quite reach it. And that's what science and philosophy and human inquiry are all about. Pushing boundaries, testing limits, venturing as close as we can to the edge of what's knowable. And maybe the simulators left hints. Maybe there are Easter eggs, hidden messages, clues embedded in the structure of reality that would reveal the truth to beings clever enough to find them. This is a fun idea. The notion that somewhere in the digits of pi or the fine structure constant or the cosmic microwave background, there's a message. Made by XYZ Corporation version 4.7, please do not disturb the inhabitants. It sounds like science fiction, and it probably is, but it's not impossible. If you were creating a simulation and wanted to leave a signature, a way for the inhabitants to eventually discover their true nature, how would you do it? You'd probably embed it somewhere deep, somewhere they couldn't find it, until they'd achieved a certain level of understanding, a certain sophistication. Maybe we haven't found it yet because we're not ready. Or maybe it's not there at all, and we're reading meaning into randomness, seeing patterns in noise, which is what human brains are extraordinarily good at doing. This connects to something called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in random sounds, find patterns in stock market fluctuations. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and sometimes they recognize patterns that aren't really there. So when we look at the universe and see hints of simulation, when we notice things that seem too convenient or too well designed, we have to be careful. Is it really evidence, or are we just seeing what we want to see? Are we finding real structure, or are we imposing our own expectations onto ambiguous data? This is why science demands rigor, demands reproducibility and skepticism and careful methodology. Because our intuitions can mislead us. Our pattern recognition systems can overfire. And when it comes to something as profound and important as the nature of reality itself, we need to be extraordinarily careful about distinguishing between what we'd like to be true and what actually is true. The simulation hypothesis is appealing in many ways. It answers big questions, it fits with certain features of quantum mechanics and cosmology, it has a kind of elegant simplicity to it. But we can't let that appeal bias our evaluation of the evidence. We have to look at it as objectively as possible, which is hard when we're the ones inside the system we're trying to evaluate. Let me think about another aspect of this that's both practical and philosophical, the role of skepticism and belief in our lives. How do we navigate uncertainty? How do we live when we can't be sure about fundamental things? This isn't unique to the simulation hypothesis. It's a general feature of human existence. We can't be absolutely certain about anything outside our immediate subjective experience. We assume the external world is real, that other people are conscious, that the past happened, that the future will come. But these are assumptions, not certainties. Philosophers have a term for this, the problem of induction. Just because the sun rose every day in the past doesn't logically guarantee it will rise tomorrow. We believe it will, and we have good reasons for that belief, but it's not certainty. The simulation hypothesis just adds another layer of uncertainty, another thing we can't be absolutely sure about. But in practice, we don't live our lives with absolute certainty about anything. We make probabilistic judgments, we trust our experiences, we build our models of reality and act based on them. And that works. That's sufficient for living. We don't need philosophical certainty to navigate daily life. We just need good enough models, reliable enough assumptions. And whether we're in a simulation or not, the models we've built, the science and common sense and practical wisdom we've accumulated, they work. They let us predict and manipulate our environment. They help us thrive and survive and build civilizations. So maybe the simulation question, while intellectually fascinating, is pragmatically less important than it seems. Maybe it doesn't really matter for how we live our lives day to day. But then again, sometimes big ideas do change how we live, even if they don't change the practical details. Knowing that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than vice versa didn't change daily life for most people, but it changed how humanity thought about itself, our place in the universe, our significance. Similarly, if we discovered we're in a simulation, it might not change what you have for breakfast, but it might change how you think about meaning and purpose and possibility. It might open up new ways of understanding consciousness and reality. It might unite humanity in a shared recognition of our cosmic context. And those changes, while not immediately practical, could be profoundly important over time. There's also the question of risk and precaution. If there's even a chance we're in a simulation, should that affect our choices? Some philosophers have argued that we should act as if we're being observed by the simulators, as if there might be consequences beyond what we can see in this reality. This is similar to Pascal's wager, the argument that you should believe in God, because if God exists, the payoff is infinite, and if God doesn't exist, you've lost little. The simulation version would be act ethically and pursue understanding, because if there are simulators watching, they might reward or value that behavior. And if there aren't, you've still lived a good life. It's a pragmatic argument not based on proving anything but on hedging your bets. I'm not sure I buy this reasoning entirely because it feels like it's based on fear or calculation rather than genuine values. I'd rather act ethically because I think it's right, because it makes life better for myself and others, not because I'm worried about cosmic judges or simulators keeping score. But it's an interesting thought experiment, and it shows how the simulation hypothesis can intersect with ethics and decision-making in non-obvious ways. Let's shift back to the science for a moment, because there's something I want to emphasize. When physicists and philosophers take the simulation hypothesis seriously, they're not abandoning scientific rigor or embracing mysticism. They're following the evidence and the logic where it leads, even when it leads somewhere strange. Science has a history of discovering that reality is weirder than we thought. Quantum mechanics, relativity, the Big Bang, dark matter, and dark energy. All of these were initially considered bizarre or impossible, but the evidence forced us to accept them. The simulation hypothesis might be the next step in that progression, or it might not. The point is to stay open, to let the evidence guide us rather than clinging to comfortable assumptions. And the evidence, as we've discussed, is suggestive but not conclusive. Quantum mechanics has features that make sense in a computational framework. The fine-tuning of physical constants suggests design. The exponential growth of computing power makes advanced simulations plausible. The Bostrom argument provides a logical structure for thinking about probabilities. But none of this is proof. It's all consistent with the simulation hypothesis, but it's also consistent with other explanations. We're in a space of high uncertainty, and we need to be comfortable with that. We need to hold our conclusions lightly, ready to revise them as new evidence comes in. This brings me to something I think is important about the human relationship to knowledge and mystery. We have this drive to understand, to explain, to reduce uncertainty. It's served us well. It's led to science and technology and medicine and all the tools and insights that make modern life possible. But we also need to be careful not to let that drive push us into premature certainty, into believing we understand things we don't, into closing questions that should remain open. The simulation hypothesis is valuable not just as a possible answer to the nature of reality, but as a reminder to stay humble, to acknowledge the limits of our understanding, to keep questioning. And there's beauty in that, in the not knowing. There's a kind of intellectual and spiritual richness in living with mystery, in being comfortable with uncertainty while still pursuing understanding. It's a balance, a middle path between nihilistic skepticism, we can't know anything so why try, and overconfident dogmatism, we know the truth and need not question further. The simulation hypothesis invites us to that middle path, to pursue knowledge rigorously while acknowledging that some questions might not have accessible answers, at least not yet, maybe not ever. So where does all of this leave us, really, after tens of thousands of words, exploring every angle I can think of, after examining the logic and the science and the philosophy and the implications? What's the takeaway? I think it's this. The simulation hypothesis is a powerful lens for thinking about reality, consciousness, and existence. It's not proven, might never be proven, but it's plausible enough that we can't dismiss it. And taking it seriously, really sitting with the possibility that we might be in a simulation, it changes things. It expands our sense of what's possible. It challenges our assumptions about what's fundamental. It connects to deep questions in physics and philosophy and computer science. It makes us think harder about consciousness and meaning and the nature of knowledge itself. But ultimately, whether we're in a simulation or not, we're still here, still experiencing, still conscious, and that's what grounds everything else. The experience of being alive, of being aware, of having this moment right now, that's undeniable. That's real in the most immediate and important sense. So we honor that reality, we engage with it fully, we live as richly and meaningfully as we can. And we stay curious about the big questions, including whether this reality we're experiencing is fundamental or derived, base or simulated, original or copy. And maybe that curiosity, that wondering, that's part of what makes us conscious in the first place. Maybe consciousness isn't just about processing information or having subjective experiences. Maybe it's about this capacity to step back, to reflect, to ask what it all means, to wonder about our own nature and the nature of everything around us. Dogs are conscious, but they don't wonder if they're in a simulation. Cats are aware, but they don't contemplate the nature of reality. But we do. We're the species that looks up at the stars and asks why. We're the ones who develop quantum mechanics and philosophy and mathematics to probe the deep structure of existence. And that makes us special, not in a chauvinistic sense, but in a very real sense. We're the part of the universe that's trying to understand itself, to know itself, to grasp its own nature. And if we are in a simulation, if we were created by some advanced civilization, maybe that's why. Maybe they wanted to create beings who would ask these questions, who would push at the boundaries of their reality, who would seek to understand and transcend and explore. Maybe we're not just experiments or entertainment. Maybe we're the simulation's way of achieving self-awareness, of looking at itself and understanding what it is. Like a strange loop, a recursive system that creates subsystems capable of reflecting on the whole. And in doing that, in being that reflection, we give the simulation meaning, we give it purpose. We complete something that couldn't be complete without consciousness looking back at its own foundations. Or maybe we're just overthinking it. Maybe we're just here, just experiencing, and all these layers of meaning and purpose are things we're adding because that's what conscious minds do. We create narratives, we find patterns, we make meaning out of the raw data of experience, and that's okay. That's not a flaw, that's a feature. That's what makes us human, what makes life interesting and valuable. We're meaning-making machines, and whether the meaning we make corresponds to some objective cosmic purpose, or whether we're generating it entirely ourselves, it's still real to us, still valuable, still worth pursuing. So as I wrap up this long exploration, this deep dive into one of the strangest and most profound questions humans can ask, I want to leave you with a sense not of certainty, but of wonder. Wonder at the fact that we can even ask these questions. Wonder at the strangeness of quantum mechanics and the vastness of the cosmos. Wonder at consciousness and existence and the sheer improbability and preciousness of being here, being aware, being alive. Whether we're in a simulation or the base reality, whether there are layers upon layers above us or we're the fundamental layer, whether our simulators are watching or we're alone, none of that diminishes the wonder. Because wonder isn't about having answers. Wonder is about staying open to mystery, staying curious, staying engaged with the profound strangeness of existence. And that's something we can do regardless of metaphysical status. That's something that makes life worthwhile, whether we're made of matter or code, whether we're fundamental or derived, whether we're original or copy. The experience of wonder, of awe, of intellectual and emotional engagement with reality, that's what it means to be fully alive. That's what it means to be human. And that's what I hope you take from this. Not a definitive answer to whether we're in a simulation, but a renewed appreciation for the mystery, the strangeness, the beauty of it all. We're here, we're conscious, we're thinking about these impossible questions. And that's extraordinary, no matter what the underlying truth turns out to be. So let's keep wondering, keep questioning, keep exploring. Let's live with curiosity and humility and courage. Let's be kind to each other because we're all navigating this mystery together. Let's create meaning and beauty and understanding because that's what we're capable of, what we're made for, whether we were made by evolution or by simulators or by something else entirely. Let's be fully present to this strange, wonderful, possibly simulated existence we've been given or generated or stumbled into. And let's see where the questions lead us, even if we never get final answers, even if the mystery remains. Because the journey, the wondering, the exploring, that's the point, that's the adventure, that's what makes it all worthwhile.